There exists a category of human beings that totalitarian movements discovered with terrifying precision. People who had become superfluous to the world, not merely unemployed or displaced, but fundamentally unnecessary to any existing social, political, or economic structure. The 20th century perfected the conditions for creating such people on a mass scale, and we are witnessing the consequences today. This superfluity is not a temporary economic condition. It represents something far more dangerous. When human beings lose their place in the world, when they cease to belong to any organized community, they become isolated masses susceptible to the most radical political movements. Understanding this phenomenon is crucial because the conditions that create superfluous people persist, and with them, the permanent threat to all political life. Chapter 1: The Birth of the Superfluous. The concept of superfluous people emerged from my analysis of totalitarian origins, but it describes a condition that extends far beyond those regimes. Superfluity means that certain groups of people have become unnecessary not only to the economic system, but to the political and social fabric of society itself. They exist, but their existence adds nothing to the world. Indeed, from the perspective of those who organize society, these people could disappear without being missed. This is fundamentally different from traditional poverty or unemployment. The poor have always existed, but they remained part of the social fabric, bound by relationships of dependency, charity, or exploitation. The superfluous, by contrast, have been cut off from all such relationships. They are truly worldless. The 20th century created the conditions for this superfluity through several interconnected processes. First, the dissolution of stable class structures that had previously provided even the most disadvantaged with some form of social identity and belonging. Second, the emergence of bureaucratic systems that could function independently of the people they supposedly served. Third, and most critically, the breakdown of political communities capable of integrating newcomers and providing spaces for human action. When I analyze the stateless people I encountered during my own years of exile, I see this superfluity in its purest form. These individuals had lost not only their homes and citizenship, but their very right to have rights. They existed in a legal limbo where no political community claimed them, and therefore no law protected them. They had become, quite literally, superfluous to the world of politics and law. But the phenomenon extends beyond the stateless. Totalitarian movements succeeded precisely because they could mobilize masses of people who had already been made superfluous by the disintegration of traditional social structures. These movements offered belonging to those who belonged nowhere, purpose to those whom society had rendered purposeless. Chapter 2: The Mechanics of Superfluity. Understanding how people become superfluous requires examining the specific mechanisms that disconnect human beings from the common world. This is not a natural process, but the result of particular political and social developments that can be analyzed and potentially reversed. The first mechanism is the destruction of what I call the space of appearance. Those public realms where people can act together and reveal who they are through speech and deed. When these spaces disappear or become inaccessible, people lose their capacity for political action, which is what makes them distinctly human. They become reduced to mere biological existence, what the Greeks called zoe rather than bios, life without a meaningful world. Modern economic systems contribute to this process by treating human labor as just another commodity to be optimized, discarded, or replaced by machines. But the real problem is not technological unemployment. It is the reduction of human beings to mere economic functions. When someone's entire social identity depends on their economic productivity, they become superfluous the moment that productivity is no longer needed. Bureaucratic administration accelerates superfluity by replacing political action with administrative processes. Instead of citizens acting together to shape their common concerns, We have clients receiving services from bureaucratic agencies. This transformation makes vast numbers of people politically superfluous, even while they remain economically integrated. They become objects of administration rather than subjects of political action. The mass media and educational systems often reinforce superfluity by promoting conformity over plurality. When society demands that people think and act in uniform ways, it effectively renders the unique perspective of each individual superfluous. Diversity of opinion and experience, what I call plurality, becomes a problem to be solved rather than the essential condition for political life. Perhaps most dangerous is the psychological internalization of superfluity. When people begin to feel that their thoughts, experiences, and judgments don't matter, they stop exercising the human capacity for critical thinking. This creates what I observed in Eichmann: the banality of thoughtlessness that makes people complicit in systems that render other human beings superfluous. The cumulative effect of these mechanisms is the creation of lonely, isolated individuals who lack any stable relationship to a common world. Such people become susceptible to ideological movements that promise to restore meaning and belonging, often through the elimination of other groups deemed even more superfluous. Chapter 3: Mass Society and the Atomized Individual. The emergence of mass society in the 20th century created new forms of superfluity that persist today. Mass society is not simply a large number of people living together. It is a specific form of social organization that atomizes individuals and destroys the intermediate associations that traditionally connected people to larger political communities. In mass society, people relate to each other not as unique individuals sharing a common world, but as members of abstract categories, consumers, voters, demographic groups. These categories are useful for statistical analysis and administrative efficiency, but they cannot provide the kind of meaningful relationships that make human life political rather than merely biological. Consider how this manifests in contemporary America. Despite living in densely populated areas, many people experience profound isolation. They may be connected through social media, but these connections often lack the reality that comes from sharing a tangible common world. Digital relationships can supplement, but cannot replace the kind of face-to-face encounters necessary for genuine political life. The breakdown of intermediate institutions, unions, churches, civic associations, neighborhood organizations, leaves individuals directly exposed to the power of mass movements and state bureaucracies. Without these mediating structures, people lose both the experience of acting together with others and the protection that comes from belonging to smaller communities. Mass entertainment and consumer culture contribute to superfluity by encouraging passivity and conformity. When people's primary relationship to the world becomes consumption of products and entertainment, they lose practice in the kinds of activities that develop judgment and the capacity for political action. They become audiences rather than actors, consumers rather than citizens. This is why I insist that political freedom cannot be reduced to liberal rights or democratic procedures. These are necessary but insufficient. Political freedom requires actual spaces where people can act together, reveal their distinct qualities, and shape their common concerns. Without such spaces, even formal democracy becomes a shell within which people remain essentially superfluous to political life. The atomization of mass society makes people vulnerable to totalitarian movements precisely because such movements offer a false remedy for loneliness and superfluity. They promise belonging, but only through the destruction of plurality and the reduction of all individuals to identical members of a mass. Recognizing this dynamic is crucial for understanding contemporary political challenges. The appeal of authoritarian populism often lies not in its specific policies, but in its promise to restore significance to people who feel they have become superfluous to the political and economic systems that govern their lives. Chapter 4: the stateless and the rightless. My own experience of statelessness taught me that superfluity reaches its most extreme form when people lose not just their social position, but their legal and political existence. The stateless person becomes what I call worldless, existing in a space outside all political communities and therefore outside the realm where human rights have any meaning. This condition reveals a fundamental flaw in our conception of human rights. We speak of inalienable rights that belong to people simply by virtue of being human. But in practice, these rights exist only within political communities that recognize and protect them. The stateless person discovers that outside such communities, there are no human rights, only the naked fact of biological existence. During my years without citizenship, I learned that losing legal status means losing the capacity to act politically. The stateless person cannot work legally, cannot move freely, cannot appeal to any authority for protection. They become dependent on the charity of others, which, however well-intentioned, reduces them to objects of pity rather than subjects capable of political action. But the condition of statelessness illuminates a broader phenomenon. In mass society, millions of people possess formal citizenship while remaining essentially rightless. They may vote, but their votes feel meaningless. They may speak, but no one seems to listen. They may work, but their labor feels disconnected from any larger purpose. They have legal rights, but lack the political power to make those rights meaningful. This is why totalitarian movements could recruit so successfully among people who were formerly citizens of democratic states. These individuals had already experienced a form of political superfluity that made them susceptible to movements promising to restore their significance through identification with a larger cause, even when that cause involved the destruction of political life itself. The refugee crisis of our time continues to produce stateless and rightless people on a massive scale. But we must recognize that this crisis is not merely humanitarian. It is fundamentally political. These displaced populations represent the extreme manifestation of processes that make people superfluous throughout the world system. Moreover, the existence of large populations without political rights threatens the political freedom of everyone. When some people can be reduced to bare life, without legal protection, it becomes easier to extend such treatment to additional groups. The boundary between citizen and non-citizen, between those who belong and those who are superfluous, becomes increasingly arbitrary and dangerous. This is why I argue that the right to have rights, the right to belong to some political community, is the most fundamental human right. Without this basic political membership, all other rights become meaningless abstractions. And in our interconnected world, the denial of this right to some ultimately threatens the political existence of all. Chapter 5: Thoughtlessness and the Banality of Superfluity. The trial of Adolf Eichmann revealed something disturbing about how ordinary people can participate in systems that render other human beings superfluous. Eichmann was not a monster driven by hatred or sadistic impulses. He was a thoughtless bureaucrat who participated in genocide through sheer inability to think about what he was doing. This thoughtlessness, the failure to engage in the internal dialogue that constitutes thinking, is both a cause and consequence of superfluity. When people stop thinking, they become superfluous to themselves. They lose the capacity for judgment that makes them uniquely human and become mere functionaries in systems they neither understand nor question. The banality of this evil is that it requires no special malice or ideological commitment. It emerges naturally from the bureaucratic organization of modern life, which fragments responsibility and reduces complex moral and political questions to technical problems requiring administrative solutions rather than human judgment. Consider how this operates in contemporary institutions. Healthcare bureaucrats make decisions about treatment based on cost-benefit analyses without ever meeting the patients affected. Educational administrators implement policies that reduce students to data points in standardized testing systems. Corporate managers eliminate jobs through spreadsheet calculations that abstract entirely from the human consequences of their decisions. In each case, the decision-makers are not necessarily cruel or malicious. They are often well-intentioned people doing their jobs according to established procedures. But their thoughtlessness makes them complicit in systems that treat human beings as superfluous whenever they fail to fit efficient administrative categories. This institutional thoughtlessness is reinforced by what I observe in modern education and culture: the replacement of thinking with opinion-having. People are encouraged to develop positions on various issues, but discouraged from the kind of sustained reflection that might lead them to question fundamental assumptions about how society is organized. The result is a population capable of functioning efficiently within existing systems, but incapable of the kind of critical thinking necessary to evaluate those systems or imagine alternatives. Such people become superfluous as political actors, even while remaining useful as economic producers and administrative clients. But thoughtlessness is not inevitable. The capacity for thinking, for the internal dialogue that allows us to examine our assumptions and judgments, remains available to every human being. The question is whether we will exercise this capacity or allow it to atrophy through disuse. This is why I emphasize that thinking is not a privilege reserved for intellectuals. It is a basic human activity that everyone can and must practice if we are to prevent the kinds of political disasters that result from widespread thoughtlessness. The alternative is a world where more and more people become superfluous, not through deliberate cruelty, but through the banal operation of thoughtless systems. Chapter 6: Judgment in an Age of Superfluity. The capacity for judgment, the ability to discriminate between right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, appropriate and inappropriate, becomes crucial when traditional standards and authorities lose their binding power. In our age, when so many people have become superfluous to existing institutions, the exercise of independent judgment offers both a form of resistance and a foundation for political renewal. Judgment is not the application of predetermined rules or the calculation of utility. It is the uniquely human capacity to evaluate particular situations without reducing them to instances of general categories. This capacity allows us to recognize the dignity and uniqueness of each person, especially when existing systems treat them as superfluous. The destruction of judgment is both a precondition and consequence of making people superfluous. When individuals lose confidence in their own capacity to evaluate situations and make distinctions, they become dependent on experts, authorities, and ideological systems to tell them what to think. This dependency makes them politically superfluous because they no longer participate as thinking beings in the ongoing conversation that constitutes political life. Totalitarian movements succeed by destroying the conditions necessary for independent judgment. They flood people with propaganda that makes meaningful discrimination impossible, create crisis conditions that seem to require immediate action without reflection, and promote ideologies that claim to explain everything through simple formulas that eliminate the need for careful thought about particular situations. But even in democratic societies, the conditions for judgment are constantly under threat. The pace of modern life leaves little time for the kind of sustained reflection that judgment requires. The complexity of modern systems makes it difficult for individuals to understand how their actions connect to larger consequences. The specialization of knowledge creates dependency on experts who may understand technical details, but lack the broader perspective necessary for political judgment. Educational systems often contribute to this problem by emphasizing the acquisition of information and skills rather than the development of judgment. Students learn to solve problems according to established methods, but not to evaluate whether the problems they are solving are worth solving or whether the methods they are using are appropriate to the situations they face. The recovery of judgment requires creating spaces where people can practice thinking together about common concerns. This cannot be accomplished through more efficient administration or better technical expertise. It requires what I call public spaces, places where people can gather as equals to discuss and debate the issues that affect their shared life. Such spaces are not merely forums for exchanging opinions. They are places where people can develop their capacity for judgment through encounter with others who see the world differently. The plurality of perspectives that emerges in genuine public discourse creates the conditions necessary for sound political judgment. This is why the creation and preservation of public spaces represents a form of resistance to the forces that make people superfluous. When people act together to address common concerns, they demonstrate their capacity for political life and refuse the reduction to mere biological existence or economic function. Chapter 7: Natality and the Possibility of New Beginnings. Despite the somber realities of superfluity and thoughtlessness, there remains something indestructible in the human condition: our capacity for natality, the ability to begin something new, to interrupt the seemingly automatic processes that reduce people to superfluous elements in vast systems. Every human birth represents this capacity for new beginning. Each person who comes into the world brings with them the potential to act in ways that no one could predict or control. This unpredictability is what makes human beings politically interesting and what totalitarian systems must destroy in order to achieve their goal of total control. The capacity for natality means that no system, however comprehensive, can permanently render human beings superfluous. As long as people retain the ability to act together in unexpected ways, they can create new possibilities for meaningful political life. This is not utopian optimism. It is a recognition of what distinguishes human life from natural processes. Throughout history, moments of political renewal have emerged when people who had been treated as superfluous suddenly acted together to claim their place in the common world. The American Revolution, which I admire as an example of genuine political founding, emerged when colonists who had been relegated to the margins of British political life acted together to create new institutions for self-government. Similarly, the civil rights movement demonstrated how people who had been systematically excluded from American political life could act together to expand the boundaries of political community. These movements succeeded not merely by demanding inclusion in existing systems, but by creating new forms of political action that revealed the dignity and capacity of those who had been deemed superfluous. But natality is not automatic. The capacity for new beginning must be cultivated through education, practiced in public spaces, and protected by institutions that preserve the conditions necessary for political action. When these conditions disappear, people lose not only their current political standing, but their capacity to create new possibilities for themselves and others. This is why I emphasize that politics is not primarily about governing or administering society. Politics is about the human capacity to act together to create something new in the world. This capacity exists wherever people gather as equals to address common concerns, regardless of whether they have formal political authority. The challenge of our time is to create conditions where this capacity can flourish despite the forces that make people superfluous. This requires both resistance to systems that reduce human beings to mere functions and positive efforts to create spaces where people can experience the joy and responsibility of political action. Such efforts cannot eliminate superfluity entirely. The forces that create it are too deeply embedded in modern life, but they can provide alternatives that demonstrate the possibility of different ways of organizing human relationships. Most importantly, they can preserve and transmit the experience of political freedom to new generations who will face their own challenges in maintaining the conditions for human plurality and action. The hope lies not in solving the problem of superfluity once and for all, but in maintaining the human capacity to begin again when existing solutions prove inadequate to the realities we face. Conclusion: the creation of superfluous people represents one of the gravest dangers facing modern democracy. When human beings lose their place in the common world, they become vulnerable to movements that promise belonging at the cost of destroying the plurality that makes political life possible. But recognizing this danger also points toward possibilities for renewal. The human capacity for thinking, judging, and acting together cannot be permanently destroyed. Every person who refuses to become merely superfluous, who insists on exercising their capacity for critical thought and political action, helps preserve the conditions necessary for human freedom. The task before us is not to eliminate all forms of superfluity that may be impossible in complex modern societies. Rather, it is to create and maintain spaces where people can experience themselves as necessary to a common world, where their unique perspectives and capabilities contribute to ongoing political life. This requires constant vigilance against the forces that make people superfluous and constant effort to create alternatives. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that each of us has both the capacity and responsibility to begin something new.